It was supposed to be just another day on Family Feud. Bright lights, familiar laughter, contestants ready to win. But from the very start, Steve Harvey felt something in the room. A pause, a silence that didn't belong. He scanned the two families. The Johnsons, loud, competitive, full of energy. And the Williams family, quieter, especially the elderly woman sitting at the end of the row. She wasn't looking at the scoreboard or even the host. She was looking down at a photograph resting gently on her lap. Her name was Evelyn, 78 years old. Silver hair, pearl necklace, a calm grace that carried both dignity and pain. When Steve called her name, she smiled politely, but the corners of her mouth trembled. "Miss Evelyn," he said cheerfully, "you ready to play?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." "All right, here we go. Name something you never forget from your childhood." The buzzers went off, answers shouted, the audience cheered, except Evelyn. Her hand hovered over the button, but never pressed it. The crowd laughed, expecting a joke, but Steve didn't laugh. He noticed the way her fingers curled around the photograph. He stopped mid-sentence. "Ma'am," he said softly, "who's that young man?" The studio went still. Evelyn hesitated, then whispered, "My grandson, Marcus. He's a Marine." Her voice cracked. "He used to say, 'Grandma, one day we're going to be on that show. You'll hit the buzzer, and we'll win.'" Steve took a breath. He looked at the crowd, at the cameras, then back to her. "And where's Marcus now?" Tears welled up in her eyes. He didn't come home. No one spoke. No one even moved. The bright set suddenly felt sacred. Steve stepped down from his podium and walked toward her. The audience watched as he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, "you don't have to play today. You've already won something no game can give you." The audience was in tears. Some covered their mouths. Some clasped their hands in silence. Steve looked at the empty chair beside her, the one Marcus was supposed to fill. He whispered, "Let's make that his seat." Then he turned toward the crowd. "Y'all, let's do something different today. Let's play this one in his honor." Producers froze. No one had told him to say that. But that was Steve Harvey. When his heart spoke, television stopped. He took off his tie, folded it neatly, and placed it on the empty chair. "This," he said. "So if you ever wonder what real leadership looks like, it isn't in the lights or the laughter. It's in the courage to stop everything for someone else's story, to see pain and answer it with presence, to turn a stage into a place of healing. That's not just hosting. That's humanity." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. And share this video so this moment and what it meant is never forgotten. Weeks passed after the taping of that unforgettable episode. But something had shifted inside Steve Harvey. He'd hosted thousands of shows, comedians, singers, celebrities. But this time, he couldn't shake what he'd seen in Evelyn's eyes. That quiet grief, that strength wrapped in silence. He started arriving earlier to the studio. Producers noticed. Instead of running through punchlines or production notes, he'd walk the empty stage, touching each podium, each light, each microphone, as if relearning what they meant. One morning, a young intern named Chelsea saw him standing there long before the crew arrived. "Mr. Harvey," she asked softly, "why do you come so early?" He smiled, looking at the empty audience seats. "Because somebody's going to sit there today who's going through hell, and they'll never say it out loud. I need to be ready for that person." That became his new ritual. Every taping, every morning, before the crowd came in, Steve would whisper a small prayer. Not for ratings, not for fame, but for purpose. "Lord," he'd say, "if there's someone in here who needs hope, don't let me miss him." And time after time, he didn't. One afternoon, during rehearsal, Steve noticed a woman in the audience wiping her eyes. She wasn't a contestant, just a visitor. He stopped everything again, crew baffled, audience murmuring. "Ma'am," he said, "what's your name?" "Angela," she replied nervously. "Angela, you okay?" She hesitated, then whispered, "I just lost my job, and my husband walked out 2 weeks later. I came here because I thought maybe I'd laugh for the first time in months." Steve paused. He didn't crack a joke. He didn't shift to another topic. He just nodded slowly and said, "Then you came to the right place, ma'am. Because that's what this show is really about. We just use laughter as the disguise." The studio broke into applause. Angela smiled through tears. Later, Steve gave her his card. He told his foundation to call her the next morning. She found work 2 weeks later. That moment never made it to air either, but it became another quiet miracle. That same season, Steve began a new segment privately within his team called One More Chair. Every month, he'd invite one person from the audience to sit beside him for a round, someone he could tell needed more than laughter. Sometimes it was a widow, sometimes a single parent. Once, it was a teenage boy with autism who said Steve's jokes were the only thing that calmed him during panic attacks. They never turned those moments into television. There were no hashtags, no headlines, just heartbeats, one human connecting to another. It became a quiet promise between Steve and his crew. We're going to leave this stage better than we found it. A year later, Steve received a handwritten letter in a small, cream-colored envelope. No return address. Just one word on the front, Evelyn. He opened it carefully. Inside were two things, a short letter and a photograph. The photo showed Evelyn sitting in her living room, holding the same framed picture of Marcus. Behind her on the wall hung a new frame, Steve's tie pressed behind glass. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Harvey, I watch your show every day since that afternoon. But not because of the jokes, because I see my grandson's laughter in your eyes. You gave me something I thought I'd lost, belonging. Marcus always said laughter is God's way of reminding us we're still alive. Thank you for reminding me too. With love, Evelyn." Steve folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He carried it every day for months. Whenever something went wrong, whenever the weight of the spotlight felt too heavy, he'd take that note out and read it quietly backstage. During one live taping, Steve shared something personal for the first time. He said, "You know, people think I'm up here to be funny, but I'm not. I'm up here to tell the truth. And the truth is, I didn't always have a stage like this. I slept in my car for 3 years. I almost quit this business 10 times. The audience went silent." He continued, voice trembling. "But every time I wanted to give up, I met someone like Evelyn. Somebody who reminded me that what I do matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human." That day, after the show, a crew member whispered to him, "You've changed the tone of this place forever." Steve smiled. "Nah," he said. "The people changed me. I just listened." Months later, the studio celebrated Family Feud's anniversary. Producers surprised Steve with a montage of moments, the laughter, the jokes, the bloopers. But at the end of the reel, something unexpected appeared on the screen. A photo of that empty chair. And next to it, the words, "In memory of Marcus Williams," and every story that found its voice here. Steve's eyes filled with tears. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and said, "Let's keep doing it the right way. One heart at a time." The audience applauded, not because of the game, but because they understood. This was no longer just Family Feud. It had become a place of redemption, a bridge between laughter and healing. That night, as the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, Steve sat alone again at his podium. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Evelyn's letter, unfolded it carefully, and read the final line aloud. "You reminded me that family isn't who you're born to. It's who you love when the world stops laughing." He smiled. He looked at that same empty chair and whispered, "You're still with us, soldier." Then he turned off the studio lights himself, one by one, until the set was dark. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred, because in that silence, somewhere between laughter and tears, Steve Harvey had found his calling. Not as a comedian, not as a host, but as a man who listens when the world forgets how. And from that day forward, every time a contestant sat down, every time an audience member laughed, every time a child pointed at the screen and said, "That's Steve Harvey," something deeper echoed beneath the noise. A legacy wasn't being filmed. It was being felt. And that, more than any punchline or trophy, was Steve Harvey's truest show point 2 years later. It happened again. Not the same story, but the same silence. A silence so deep, it reached through the cameras and into Steve Harvey's chest. It was a Tuesday taping. The audience was full, the lights were warm, and laughter was everywhere. But just before the show began, Steve caught sight of a man sitting alone near the back of the audience. No smile, no phone, no excitement, just a stillness, like someone who wasn't really there. Something in Steve's spirit told him to pause. He'd learned to trust that instinct, the same voice that had made him stop the show years ago for Evelyn. When the cameras rolled and the crowd cheered, Steve did something unexpected. He turned away from the families on stage and looked straight at the audience. "Sir," he said gently, "I see you in the blue shirt. You okay, man?" The cameras swung toward the man. He looked startled, almost guilty. "I'm fine," he muttered, trying to wave it off. But Steve didn't let it go. "Nah," he said softly, "you ain't fine. I've seen a lot of smiles in this room, and yours don't match your eyes." The audience went silent. Even the contestants froze. That's when a man stood up. His voice cracked as he said, "I just lost my wife. Last month. She loved this show." The silence that followed was heavy enough to break the lights. Every person in the room knew this wasn't part of the script. Steve walked off the stage, no hesitation, and approached him slowly. "What was her name?" he asked. "Dana," the man said. She used to make me laugh so hard when we watched you. She said you reminded her of her brother." Steve nodded. "Sounds like she had good taste." The man laughed weakly, tears falling. "I almost didn't come today," he admitted. "I bought these tickets months ago. I thought maybe, I don't know, maybe I'd feel close to her again." Steve took a deep breath. Then he said the kind of words that only come from experience, from loss, from faith, from the places laughter can't reach. "Brother, you did the right thing. Sometimes you gotta walk right into where it hurts to find the part that still loves." The man covered his face, sobbing quietly. Steve placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dana's laughing right now, man. You don't feel it, but she's here. You brought her with you." The audience broke. Some are crying. Some are praying. Even the crew behind the cameras wiped their eyes. Steve turned toward the families on stage and said, "You know what? Let's dedicate this round to Dana. Let's make it loud for her." The crowd erupted. They clapped, shouted her name, and filled the studio with a kind of joy that didn't erase pain. It transformed it. Later that day, after the show ended, Steve found the man again backstage. He handed him a card with just 5 words written in his own handwriting. "Keep walking. She's still watching." The man hugged him tightly. "You don't know what you just did for me," he whispered. Steve smiled. "Oh, I know. Because once somebody did it for me, too." That night, Steve went home to a quiet house. He sat in his living room, lights dimmed, thinking about all the people who'd sat before him. Evelyn, Malik, Angela, and now this man who came to remember his wife. He looked around at the awards on his shelf, the trophies, the plaques, the framed magazine covers, and he realized something. None of it mattered if the laughter didn't leave love behind. He took out a notebook, one he'd been keeping since the empty chair episode, filled with names and short notes, people he'd met, stories he'd carried. At the very top of the page, he wrote in capital letters, "People before performance." And from that night on, it became his personal creed. Months later, he launched a new outreach program quietly, without cameras or press. He called it Second Chances. Every month, he and his staff invited people from shelters, hospices, and hospitals to attend Family Feud as guests, not just to watch, but to be seen. There were no photo ops, no branding, just humanity. Sometimes he'd walk off the stage mid-segment to shake a hand or offer a hug. Sometimes he'd pause filming for a full minute of silence, something unheard of in television production, just to let the room breathe. And yet, those are the tapings the crew remember the most. They started calling those moments Harvey Halos, the instant when laughter stopped and grace took over. One evening, after a particularly emotional show, a producer pulled Steve aside and said, "You know, every time you stop the show, the network loses a few minutes of airtime." Steve smiled and replied, "Yeah, but somebody out there gains a few minutes of hope. I'll take that trade any day." Years later, long after that moment with Evelyn, a museum curator called Steve's team. They wanted to include his empty chair episode in an exhibit about empathy in entertainment. When they asked what he wanted displayed, Steve said only one thing. "Not the suit, not the cards, just that tie I left on the chair." and maybe the photo of the Marine. Let people remember what really matters." The curator agreed. That exhibit would go on to inspire thousands. And at the center, under warm golden light, a small plaque read, "The day a comedian stopped the show and started healing." Now, every new host who steps on that stage hears the same quiet story passed down by the crew. They say, "If you ever feel the room change, don't fight it. Just listen." That's what Steve would do. Because long after the jokes fade and the lights dim, the truest part of Steve Harvey's legacy remains. Not the laughter, not the fame, but the moments when he looked into someone's pain and answered it with presence. He turned entertainment into empathy. He turned silence into sanctuary. And he proved again and again that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stop the show and start feeling.